Hello and welcome to Learn Liberty Live. I'm your host, Evan Schwartztrauber, and today we're going to be talking about Karl Marx. Of course, libertarians and people of all political stripes and ideologies have a lot of thoughts about Marxism and communism, but does Marx get a bad rap? Have we ever actually seen his ideas put into practice? And what can we say about all of the other isms that have spawned from his work, like Leninism and Maoism? Well, let's turn to our guest, Brandon Turner, Associate Professor of Political Science at Clemson University. His work focuses on the history of political thought, modern thought, and early debates over the nature of commercial society. You can see his work in the journals Political Theory and in Polity. Brandon, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
To kick off our discussion, for people who don't know, who was Karl Marx and what was he all about?
There's a lot going on with Marx, and just to give you some biographical detail, so Marx is born in 1818 in Trier, grows up in Germany and in Prussia. His sort of mature period, the period where we begin to know Marx as a thinker of some import, begins in 1844 or so. He writes the Manifesto in 1848, right in the midst of a series of huge revolutions that go on across Europe. I mean, just generally known as the revolutions of 1848. And he moves to London the following year, and he actually spent the rest of his life. He was a journalist by trade, so there's a few sort of strange. We tend to have this conception of Marx being this sort of alien figure come out of nowhere from the depths of German philosophy, but the guy actually was a British journalist. Lived in England, was a British journalist for most of his life. So in terms of the composition of his great works, you could say begins in 1844 with the philosophical manuscripts, and it ends towards the end of the 1870s. He dies in, I think, 1883 or something like that. So that's the general biographical sketch. In terms of Marx was reluctant to put his name on any particular school or ideology. He famously wrote that if there was a thing called Marxism, then he wasn't a Marxist. He wrote that towards the end of his life when people had started to apply his ideas in various ways. So he was really reluctant to sort of pin down an ideology. But when it comes to his thought, his thought forms the backbone of any number of different methodologies, approaches to the social sciences. Sociology, for example, is heavily influenced by Marxist mode of analysis. In political science and economics, they all have their sort of Marxist strands. Continental philosophy, the same. So just a figure of immense, you might say, philosophical influence, and a figure of immense political influence. So there was a time during the 20th century when literally half the world's population lived in countries, lived in nation states, which operated, at least ostensibly, claimed to operate according to the principles of Marxism. So it's difficult to identify a thinker whose work has had more sort of real life influence in the history of philosophy.
So that brings us to our next question, but I just want to remind viewers of this program that we'd love to get your questions at any point throughout the show on anything that we're discussing, and we'll try to get to all of them. I'm sure with a topic like Marxism, we'll be getting a flood of questions soon enough. But it's interesting that you mentioned that about half the world's population at some point lived under a regime that claimed to be Marxist. Is it actually fair to lay that at the feet of Marx? If you look at his ideology in its purest form, workers own the means of production, the proletariat overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Have we actually seen something like that? Or does it always just become a dictatorship where there's a privileged class, like what you saw in the Soviet Union, what you see in China today, and then everyone else is screwed, but it's not a truly communist utopia the way that Marx had envisioned?
There's a lot. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There's a lot going on here. So I would say this. If you asked Marx, and if you asked Marx's people who today claim to still follow Marx, they would say very strongly that no, Marxism has never been tried. That in its, we've never seen anything like Marxism in its purest form, that Marxism was co-opted by various interests, the interests of the nation state, the interests of the capitalist class, whatever the case may be. And there is a certain sense in which there is a very real difference between the kind of social and economic system organization that Marx supported, that he articulated, and then what was actually realized after men like Lenin and Stalin and Mao put his ideas into practice. So I'll say this: there is that difference, and that there is a huge conceptual space there between Marxism and Marxist-Leninism and all the various offshoots of Marxism. At the same time, particularly libertarians, we have at our fingertips some incredibly powerful explanations for why Marxism tends to work out the way that it does. I mean, there are no greater figures in the history of post-Marxist studies than Mises and Hayek. I mean, I would actually call this the master theme of Hayek's work. It's something that begins, as early as The Road to Serfdom and even before that, and that doesn't end until the fatal conceit. The fatal conceit, the conceit that he's referring to is precisely the conceit of those who think that a Marxist way of orienting ourselves towards one another, a kind of non-alienated way of existing with others, can be applied to what Hayek calls a macro order, or a large-scale global society. And for Hayek, it simply can't be done. And throughout his career, and throughout Mises' career, he identifies at great length and with incredible sophistication, he identifies why that's the case, both economically and socially. So, in other words, I'd say this: I mean, to be as sort of academically and to be as fair as possible, it is the case that there has been no large scale, and by this I mean anything more than the kinds of communes that we see in in New York or kibbutzes or something like that. There's been no large scale implementation of the sorts of societies that Marx articulated.
And is this because of human nature? So you mentioned that these small scale communes, I mean, we associate that with the growth of the hippie movement in the United States and around the world, where a handful of people can live on a farm somewhere, somehow be self-sufficient and live a Marxist way because it's only a small group. And the problem with human nature certainly seems to get worse with scale. Looking at every leader that's tried to adopt this ideology. So we have Lenin, we have Stalin, we have all the other Soviet leaders, we have Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, the Kim dynasty in North Korea. I mean, there's so many examples of different strains of communism that all claim to be rooted in Marxism, to just that it's impracticable, that it's just impossible to impose Marxism without force? Or is there something going on here? And has any one of these leaders actually done a decent job of trying to implement this?
Right. So, I mean, I think you put your finger on it when you mentioned human nature. So, this I think is the real crux of the Marxist project, and I think it's the crux that libertarians in particular are very well situated to learn a lot from. And it's this. So, libertarians have this kind of very rich sociological, anthropological account of human nature. Right, we see it in men like Smith and Hume and Montesquieu, down to sociologists Tocqueville, Schills, Weber. I mean, all these resources that tell us, listen, human nature is a particular way. Human beings tend to be motivated by what we might call our economic self-interest, and absent certain contexts of incredibly high levels of social trust, incredibly high levels of fellow feeling and all this kind of stuff, ultimately this self-interest is going to be a kind of universal principle of motion, right? Ultimately, this is going to be the best principle upon which we can accurately predict human behavior. And for Marx, this is the important crux to understand, is that for Marx, right, what we attribute to human nature, he attributes to what we might call false consciousness. So in other words, he would say, it is absolutely the case that in a capitalist society, individuals are motivated in the first place by something like economic self-interest. However, right, for him, this economic self-interest is a kind of mental construct that is built within each and every one of us from the very days that we're born, right? So in other words, we imbibe a kind of cultural and class consciousness without even recognizing it. And it's through this class consciousness that we adopt certain attitudes about property, certain attitudes about economic gain, about exploitation, about all these kinds of things. And so for Marx, I mean, this is ultimately the empirical question that Marx didn't come close to resolving. The question is, how do we get from this alienated state, this state in which we all suffer from this false consciousness, in which we all rely on economic self-interest as a way of understanding ourselves and our role in the world, how do we get from that state to a non-alienated state in which we recognize, universal fellowship and all this kind of stuff? And so, for Marx, there had to be a kind of the class consciousness had to sort of arise from the bottom up. Right? So the working classes, their lot would be so increasingly miserable, right? They themselves would be so increasingly large. That is, the working class would get steadily bigger and bigger. And the means of articulating the ideas of class consciousness would become greater and greater. So in other words, right, what the capitalist class is doing is they're pulling in all of these people who used to be dispersed all across the countryside. They're pulling them all into cities. They're putting them all in touch with one another in factories and in closed social settings. And they're making each and every one of them worse off every single day. That conflict has to reach such a pitch that this sort of bottom-up swelling of the working class will undo the capitalist order, right, through a violent revolution. Now, the crazy kind of historical fact is that for Marx, it had to be someplace like England that had reached what he saw as the pitch of industrial advancement. It had to be someplace like England that would lead this revolution, when in fact it turned out to be Russia, which was not anything like England in terms of industrial development, in terms of its intellectual class or anything like that.
So is that one of the central ironies here, is that while Marx assumed that it would be the capitalist strongholds like the United States or the United Kingdom, where the conditions in factories and some of the foundations of the progressive movement in general, poor working conditions, child labor, things like that, would eventually lead to a revolution, but we've actually seen it in countries with large, at the time at least, agricultural economies and not much of a rich class, and it was really rebelling against the existing monarchies. At least you could say that in Russia and China. So was Marx just wrong about where his ideology would take off?
Well, to be clear, I think Marx was wrong about that, but I think he's in this particular instance, it's difficult to fault him for what happened for the ways that the Russians adopted his ideas. And so this is where Lenin really kind of steps in, and this is where somebody like Stalin and Mao steps in, and they say, listen, we can't wait. The time is not ripe for this bottom-up revolution to take place. We're going to have to kind of speed things up a bit. And the way that things are sped up, the general name we give to this would be something like vanguardism. You probably heard the term the vanguard of the revolution. And the basic idea is that Russia and China and these other countries, that they would become, in some sense, one-party centralized states. And the goal of this party would be the goal of raising class consciousness, right? So the nation state itself would become the tool of the vanguard, would become the tool by which consciousness is raised, would become the tool by which socialists, basically sort of early stages of socialism, is turned into communism, right? If we can't wait for the revolution to happen organically, we can sort of pull the people up to us, right? We recognize already. So go ahead. Yeah.
So the role of the state is a fundamental corruption of Marxism. The idea that the government has to be forcing this on people because it doesn't happen quickly enough. Now, I just want to bring in a couple audience questions because,
sure.
As I expected, there's a lot. People have a lot to say about this. Tom Savage asks, economist Joseph Schumpeter ascribes 4 roles that Marx plays. the prophet, the sociologist, the economist, and the teacher. Are these roles the proper way to view Marx? Can we think of these roles as separate? Thanks for the question, Tom.
Yeah. Hey, Tom. And thanks for the question. I mean, I would say Schumpeter's analysis of Marx is actually really great. It's a fantastic place to start. And it's what I really like actually about Schumpeter's analysis is that it's, in large part, it's a non-ideological approach to Marx. I mean, Schumpeter always, I mean, I think if you ask particularly any libertarian economists, you know, who to read on Marx, Schumpeter is a name that's going to come up a lot. And I think you're going to learn more about Marx from somebody like Schumpeter than you're going to learn from somebody like Rothbard or somebody like Rand or something like that. Just in terms of understanding the role that Marx played in the academy and in the intellectual world, particularly in the late 19th and early part of the 20th century. In terms of how to understand Marx, I mean, so I would say Schumpeter's analysis, the four ways of thinking about Marx, that's a pretty good way of understanding it. I mean, in other words, to respond to the question, Tom, I would say, yes, those are pretty good. I think it's important for classical liberals to grasp all of these dimensions of Marx. Marx cannot stay the kind of the sort of the boogeyman in the kind of this weird and bizarre box, the way that he has in the past. In particular, if we want to begin to understand the sorts of threats to the liberal order that are beginning to emerge today, we've got to begin to understand, and we've got to begin to read Marx in different and more interesting ways.
So that's a fascinating point, which brings us to another audience question, because you're essentially suggesting that it's so easy to just dismiss Marx and say, look at what he wrought. You know, look at the tens of millions of people who died, the 5-year plans that led nowhere, that killed people. But if we just use that as a shortcut at Marx, the potential similarities to libertarianism and maybe how he was influenced by it, then we might actually be doing a disservice and kind of ignoring the underlying trends here. And that's what Todd Williams is asking about. He's saying, what is your take on the modern interpretation of, quote, cultural Marxism? Yeah. And first, define the term cultural Marxism before giving your take on the modern interpretation. And Todd, thanks for the great question.
Okay, so let me address two sides of that. So I do want to be somewhat clear here. So there is Alan Kors, the former, actually he might still be the president of FIRE, and historian at University of Penn at Penn gives this great talk on Marxism and the lessons of Marxism. And I don't know the title of the talk, but the refrain is, the lessons of Marxism are contained in all the millions upon millions of bodies that piled up. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that. And to be clear, I don't want to come down on the side that says Marx can't be held responsible for these sorts of things.
Right,
I do think there are elements of Marxism that, without question, when loosed upon 20th century Europe, had, just unfathomably awful consequences. But I'll say this though: something that libertarians need to be a little bit better at is distinguishing, on the one hand, certain ideologies, political ideologies, right, which have a way of sort of floating and sort of shaping themselves, and they have a logic to them that's specific to them. So this particular domain is specific. But then there's another set of problems having to do with the rise and the growth of the nation state, which I do not think that these two things can be collapsed. But we tend to collapse these in a number of ways. When libertarians talk about the Civil War, for example, the American Civil War, they tend to say, well, yeah, we had to free the slaves and this kind of stuff. But with the Civil War, right, that's when America became this great centralized state. And that might, on the one hand, be true, but it's simultaneously not true that America was somehow going to resist the sorts of pressures that produced, including commercial pressures, that produced the nation state over the course of 300 to 500 years. I mean, those two processes have to be treated separately. They have to be understood separately. And not only that, but we also have to understand the way that markets, in particular the spread of global markets and the spread of global currencies and national currencies and this kind of thing, the way that the development of markets and the development of the nation state went together. So I'll put those things over there. as to the question of cultural Marxism, so cultural Marxism is a term that I see a lot on the web that I don't have a full handle on, but let me tell you what I think it means. So I think it has something to do with the way that Marxism was appropriated by another philosophical movement associated with the Frankfurt School. So the name Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, comes up a lot in these conversations, and Marcuse wrote a couple of very influential works, a very short piece called Essay on Liberation, which I recommend to anyone. It's like 120 pages long, and it will give you, I mean, you could do it in an afternoon. It would give you incredible insight to the kinds of cultural politics that we are inundated with, from university campuses to the Gawker network and everything in between. And so Marcuse's arguments were in effect this, and hopefully this answers the viewer's question. If I don't, I apologize. Marcuse's began with this basic fact, right? That at some point, the bourgeois class was able to co-opt Marxism, or was able to co-opt, excuse me, was able to co-opt the class struggles that undergirded the Marxist project. And in particular, what capitalism was able to do, and what the bourgeois class was able to do, is they were able to use consumerism, right? The idea of material goods and the attitude which views life as, in some way, right, the pursuit of more and more material goods. It was able to use this way of life as a way of domesticating the working classes. So in other words, so this is something that we libertarians pay a lot of attention to, actually. So when people say, when people talk about inequality, when people talk about poverty, we as libertarians have been very good at pointing out rising standards of living, and we've been particularly good at pointing out that we can measure rising standards of living, not just in terms of gross income or whatever, but also in terms of, like, we all have iPhones now, we all have flat screen TVs, we all have great medical care and all this kind of stuff. What Marcuse was able to say is that, listen, actually, these, what we think of as being the great material benefits of capitalism, the flat screen TVs, the iPhones, these may actually be, in some sense, the means that bourgeois capitalism has appropriated for keeping the working classes in check, right? So in other words, as long as you can keep the working classes chasing the next iPhone, as long as you can keep them plugged into to Netflix and to whatever else, they won't be pursuing any revolutionary class-oriented goals. And so for Marcuse, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just so for people to kind of conceptualize what that looks like in our modern world or not so modern world. I mean, there's that famous Coca-Cola ad, which served as the series finale for Mad Men.
Right. Yeah.
And it was a bunch of people dressed like hippies, great multicultural and diverse display. I can teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. And it was a Coca-Cola ad. Yeah. And it's hard to find a company that better represents capitalism and the multinational corporation than Coca-Cola. And yet here they were using the message of the hippie movement. Is that kind of what we see with cultural Marxism, and the capitalist class is defining what success is, whether that's owning a television or something like that, where maybe Marx would prefer that success be defined as the overthrow of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, so, well, I would say this. So the question, I think cultural Marxism becomes, where we see it today, so if I open up, so where I've seen the phrase cultural Marxism tends to be in the right blogosphere. And so those who are using the term cultural Marxism are attempting to describe the kinds of strategies that Marcuse recommended. So Marcuse, for example, recommended, right, using the universities to radicalize students, to, I mean, this is all right there in the essay on liberation. I want to be clear, this is not, not a conspiracy theory. I'm not making any huge claims about the cultural left or anything like that. Right, Marcuse said relatively straightforwardly, right, we need to use the universities as a way of sort of subverting dominant cultural expectations and dominant cultural norms, right? So in other words, and Marcuse was one of the first people that I know of to begin to use the word establishment with a capital E to refer to something like the man, right? The man being the kind of the combination of, on the one hand, big business and big government, right? So the universities and the youth would be a kind of spearhead, and that through experimenting in non-consumerist ways of living, they would problematize and they would rupture these sort of dominant cultural paradigms. But of course, for Marcuse, I mean, mass consciousness in the 20th century was about getting people to recognize their own patterns of consumption as the very chains that keep them chained to this way of life. So in other words, saying, listen, Marcuse is saying to all of us, right, you have within you this radical potential to live a free and creative and original life, but this radical potential is being snuffed out by the basically the capitalist nation state that keeps you enchained, that keeps you tied to your televisions and your phones, right? And effectively you're watching your life go by as you check Facebook and all this kind of stuff. Of course, he didn't live to see Facebook. He's talking about the movie, like Star Wars and stuff like that. I mean, he's talking about cultural products from 30, 40 years ago. But reading it then now, you can see how easily, I mean, it just seamlessly maps on to cultural conversations that we have today.
And we're going to get into the modern applications of this debate a little bit later in the show, but we've got another question getting back to this idea of Marxism in theory versus in practice. And Blake Martin, one of our viewers, is looking for some advice from you on how to argue with people about this topic. And I'll paraphrase this question because it's a little long, but he's essentially saying that socialists will argue that there's a correct way to implement that with the right combination of leaders and a lack of corruption, that you can do it. And how do you argue against that, essentially?
Yeah, ultimately what it comes down to is whether or not you think human nature is mutable, right? So
and these people claim that they can change human nature with the right leadership.
Yeah, so this is an empirical at some level. This is an empirical claim, right? You can test this, and as far as I can tell, there hasn't been any clear demonstration that under the proper circumstances, people can adopt radically different conceptions of themselves and the people around them. So I would say, so in other words, there seems to be Marxism suffers from the same sort of utopian qualifications that other total visions suffer from, right? So if the world were utterly different, yeah, it could work, but the world isn't utterly different. I mean, if he's looking for a good place to look at this, I still think Hayek's Fatal Conceit actually is the best discussion of this. So in particular, the ways, by the end of his career, the way that Hayek thought that even our kind of intuitive moral thought, which, Marxists tend to really push on the ways that capitalism requires us to mute or to act against our basic moral intuitions, right? Marxists will often say things like, stop what you're doing and think about the kind of relationships you have with other people, and think about the way that these relationships are corrupted by commercial behavior. So, in other words, there is a real tension there between our basic moral intuitions and between our commercial activity, or the sorts of activities that we have to engage in order to be successful in a capitalist society. And so, on the one hand, you could say that the difference between these two things has something to do with human nature, and then you get into these kind of not particularly constructive conversations about what really is human nature and is it corrupted and all this kind of stuff. But Hayek just he just lays out this argument, says, listen, we have these moral intuitions that were developed a long time ago, right? And these moral intuitions help us thrive in, for example, the family setting, right? So in other words, Hayek has this great conversation about, listen, micro orders like the family or like small associations, they don't operate according to the kinds of rules that we expect people in a property-based market society to operate according to, right? We don't treat our kids like employees. we don't treat other members of an association that we're in, we don't treat them like our boss or like our employees or whatever. And Hayek says that's good, right? So if we applied the principles of cooperation that we use in a macro order to a micro order, right, we risk destroying that micro order, right? You ought not to treat your kids like customers because they aren't customers. And there is some fundamental break there. But likewise, right, once we think about our behavior in the macro order, we cannot go about having, global markets or, markets that try to coordinate the activity of 300 million people dispersed across the United States, 300 million people with different ethnic and religious backgrounds, with different family backgrounds. We cannot hope to coordinate their activity in a peaceful and cooperative way according to the principles that govern a micro order, right? We can't expect them to trust each other. We can't expect them to trust one another. We can't expect them to just take someone's good word to take it on faith and all this kind of stuff.
Well, that's really interesting that you say that, because you could say all the same things about libertarianism. And now for the fun part of the show where everyone sends me hate mail because I try to compare Marxism to libertarianism. So sorry, but I mean, so we some of the problems with Marxism: human nature, micro being translated into macro, the scalability, relying on people to act rationally. Could you make all the same arguments about libertarianism? Could you essentially say that libertarianism is the opposite end of this spectrum, where we're living in a theoretical world where everyone's nice and respects each other's property, but that does not happen at a large scale? Or, to be fair to libertarianism, you could say, just like Marxism, we've never seen a pure implementation, so the jury is still out. But is this just two sides of the same coin?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a good question. Undoubtedly, I'll also piss some libertarians off here.
That's okay. It's fun,
right? And there's I mean, the old saying about, right, there's no rivalries like sibling rivalries, and there's no fights quite like familial fights and all this kind of stuff. So I would say this, right? So there's different species of libertarianism. There are more or less utopian species of libertarianism. There's a kind of philosophical libertarianism that kind of terminates in, say, Rothbard or Rand or Nozick, and there's a kind of economics-oriented libertarianism that terminates in something like anarcho-capitalism. Both of those, and I don't consider myself an adherent to either of those views. Both of those, I do think, suffer from the same tendency to suspend certain principles of reality. So in particular, so if you go on a site like C4SS, which, I mean, I love the work that they do at C4. I mean, just the Center for a Stateless Society. I'm sure you guys know about their work. And to be clear, I would totally recommend the C4SS archives. They do an amazing amount of work with the kind of limited resources that they have at their disposal. But if you go on there, right, so if you look at somebody like Proudhon, right, so Proudhon, depending on who you ask, Proudhon is either an integral part of the libertarian tradition, or he's a socialist. And the fact is he's both, right? In the 19th century, there are a whole stream of thinkers, some of them American, some British, who were some species of what we would today think of as libertarianism, but also avowed socialists, who believe that economics ought to operate according to the labor theory of value and all. I mean, the whole 9 yards. So absolutely, libertarianism, particularly at the edges, falls prey to the same kind of utopianism, or whatever you want to call it, the same tendency to spend reality in certain places. However, there's a very big middle realm, the realm that I would call something like classical liberalism, and that includes people like Adam Smith, people like John Stuart Mill, people like, and so my own personal favorites in this vein would be David Hume and Montesquieu. So Hume and Montesquieu, I think both of them do this phenomenal job of, and actually I would see Hayek as very much coming out of this tradition, somebody like Hayek. They do a phenomenal job of trying to describe the evolution of institutions that bring about what we think of as being a free society, right? So society oriented around individual rights, including property rights. So they give a story of how these institutions arise and how these institutions arise in a way that's connected up to a consistent and coherent view of human nature, right? So the views of human nature that I find in Hume's treatise, for example, strike me as, at least in some general sense, true. And the account of the evolution of institutions, in particular the institution of private property, out of that, somewhat tragically fallen conception of human nature, I find to be very persuasive and very, very useful in finding where something like Marxism and where certain kinds of radical libertarianism tend to go off the rails.
So we've gotten so many questions. I want to thank our audience for being so engaged.
This is my time to sign off, I think.
To all of them. So I want to make some time to talk about the present day and what we're looking at currently, and to put this debate in the context of modern times. So we have a year where neither major party candidate in the presidential election really stood up for capitalism in a meaningful way. You had now President Trump, then candidate Trump, against immigration, against free trade. Hillary Clinton, maybe in the Podesta emails, was for open borders, but not certainly publicly. And she at least changed her mind about free trade. I mean, and you're seeing the rise of populist movements all across the world. It's not just in the United States.
Right.
My friend Ash Gazarian, thanks for the question, Ash, asks, bringing this back to the present, what's your assessment of Marxism as potentially making a comeback in the present day? And, keeping in mind Occupy Democrats, the resistance to Trump, the skepticism about capitalism, particularly among young people.
No.
Are we going to see a comeback of Marxism?
Right.
Failures of capitalism.
So can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, your video got a little slow. So I would say a few things. So I would say this, to the extent that we've seen the return of certain ideas of Marx, I think we see it on both the left and the right. So if you want to talk about, so in other words, I'll say this, I think we have to distinguish between something like Marxism and something like welfarism. So welfarism, just the view that the state, that the nation state as an entity has as one of its primary features, one of its primary obligations, has the obligation to take care of its citizens materially, right? So in other words, the attitude that underwrites Social Security, that underwrites Medicare, that underwrites all this sort of stuff. That doesn't even strike me as a particularly Marxist idea for a number of different reasons. And in fact, in the manifesto, for example, Marx derides welfarist communists because he says, listen, for the revolution to take place, consciousness has to be raised, this has to be bottom up. The working classes have to be immiserated to the point where they rise up. And if you give them, healthcare and flat screen TVs and all this kind of stuff, then they're not going to do this. So in other words, I think it's important to distinguish between something like nationalism, which I think we have seen a great rise of nationalism, particularly on the right today, and Marxism. Which one of these is more dangerous to individual liberty? I don't want to say either way. But when it comes to kind of contemporary politics, I would say that most of what we're seeing is that what we're worried about is the kind of the return of Marxism on the left. I think is really just various versions of the return of welfarism. So if you look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, right, Bernie Sanders is a socialist the way that one guy in every philosophy class claims to be a socialist or an anarchist or whatever. I mean, he by very few measures is Bernie Sanders a socialist. Right, so he may have been like a long time ago talked about nationalizing banks and all this kind of stuff. But for the most part, I think Sanders supporters, they just want more. They just want more what we think of as welfare programs. In other words, they want reductions in student loans. They want better access to healthcare, all this kind of stuff, and they want it provided by the nation state. So in other words, they're redistributionists. But very few of them are really advocating for, worker ownership of the means of production. Or
state-run industry. Yeah.
What's that? Sorry.
Or state-run industry. I mean, maybe it's just Bernie is comparatively more socialist than his colleagues, but not really a true socialist unless he really supported nationalizing basically everything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's right. Or even or nationalizing anything. Again, I mean, so Bernie's talking about nationalizing the banks. But maybe education. I mean, you might say that he's talking about effectively nationalizing them, but you just don't see much of the zeal for revolution with Bernie that you do when you read somebody like Marx. And ultimately, the cornerstone of communism and what Marx thought had to happen for Marxism, to the extent that it's an ism to be realized, is the eradication of private property, the complete and utter abolishment of private property, which is the kind of physical and institutional manifestation of alienation. And you hear no one talking about getting rid of private property altogether. Again, you hear them talking about redistributing property, but that's a different sort of question. So I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you finish your thought. Sorry.
No, I think I've actually said all I have to say on that.
So just continuing on this theme of Marxism returning, and you mentioned that it's not just on the left; it's on the right as well. And a particularly interesting phenomenon this year has been the Republican Party, which has traditionally been at least self-described as more capitalist, more free market. But certainly things about President Trump's stance on trade would contradict that. And, speaking of some of these thinkers who were influenced by Marx, Steve Bannon, a controversial figure currently in our political system, used to run Breitbart, is now the senior advisor to Trump. He once described himself as a Leninist and that he wanted to abolish the state. So it's kind of interesting for a Republican in a position of power to be saying that. Make of that? I mean, does that mean anything significant? Should our viewers take anything away from the fact that there's someone in the White House who describes himself as a Leninist?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I guess not to be too strident about it, but I mean, I see the rise of Trumpism as an unmitigated disaster for libertarians and classical liberals of all stripes. It's in many ways the worst of all possible worlds, and for a number of reasons. I mean, actually, when it comes to Leninism, when it comes to Sovietism or whatever you want to call it, I mean, it's sometimes helpful for us to remember that for many years, the symbol of the difference between life in a free society and life in Soviet society was the Berlin Wall. It was a wall. In other words, the symbol of collectivism, of our lives being oriented around some collective notion of the good that we may or may not share. The symbol of that was, in fact, the wall that they built in Berlin. And yet here we are, 30, 40 years after Reagan talks about, tear down the wall. Here we are building a wall. I mean, and it's not just the building the wall, which I realize that, there was a fence before and all this kind of stuff. It's the symbolic importance of the wall in this current climate, I think is a really good indicator of just how bad things have gotten. Now, when it comes to somebody like Bannon and something like Trumpism, this is a good place actually where I think libertarians and classical liberals can really see the sorts of advantages we get from drawing from the tradition that includes people like Hume and Montesquieu, particularly when it comes to things like the rule of law. So when we tend to think about is Hillary free market or is Trump free market or anything like this, I think we tend to lose sight of what it would mean to be free market. So, what is it that enables people to trade with one another? What is it that enables us to feel secure in our property? It's things like the independent judiciary and the rule of law. And to the extent that the Trump administration has at least signaled, as far as I can tell, an unprecedented hostility to these basic principles, that is a real problem, right? So, in other words, being pro-free market or whatever, I mean, Trump, talks a lot about his pro-business views and his, how he's going to be the pro-business president and the best jobs president that God ever created and all this kind of stuff. I mean, we have to remember that markets are more than just the volume of trade. Markets are more than just wealth. Markets are about more than just stock indexes, right? Markets have to do with freedom of contract. They have to do with the independence of the courts. They have to do with the idea of promises and the idea that the nation itself is bound to these promises. And the sense that you get, and the sense that has me really worried today, when you read somebody like Hume and Montesquieu, is that we don't have a great grasp on how institutions like the rule of law come into being. I mean, in the West, it took, depending on who you ask, it took 700 to 1,000 years to develop slowly, organically, over time, through various fits and starts to develop something like the rule of law. And once it's gone, once the respect for the courts and the respect for rule of law and all this kind of stuff, once it's gone, it's very, very difficult to recapture. And so I think as libertarians, in classical liberals, this is a very good time to refocus our attention towards institutions and the way that particular institutions, as they've developed in particular states and across particular states, the way that these prop up these much bigger ideas about markets and trade and free movement and all that kind of stuff.
Well, with that call to action, we'll leave it there. My guest has been Brandon Turner, Associate Professor of Political Science at Clemson. You can check out his work in the journals Political Theory and Polity, focusing on the history of political thought, early modern thought, and the early debates over the nature of commercial society. Brandon, thank you so much for what was a fascinating discussion.
Thanks to Learn Liberty for having me.
Thank you for all your questions, and we always love having you watch. If you liked this video, make sure to make that official, or make that official rather, by liking the video on Facebook. And better yet, share this so all your friends can see how awesome you are and how awesome we are. But otherwise, we'll see you next time we do a show. Thanks for watching.